The rain that morning did not simply fall, it wept, each drop striking the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, as if the sky itself were mourning alongside the pain inside one man's heart. And within those walls the world seemed frozen, with cold marble floors, untouched luxury furniture, and a silence so heavy it could bring a grown man to his knees. Beyond the glass, somewhere behind the mist and condensation, Central Park lay blurred and gray, but Jonathan Blake could no longer truly see it, for the only thing staring back at him was his own reflection with sunken, quiet eyes above the same wrinkled shirt he had worn since the day before. For many men, power means control, and John had built an entire empire just to ensure absolute control. Yet now no amount of power could change a thing. Not when his daughter, his little girl of 6 years old named Lily, had refused to eat properly for months, and completely stopped for the last 4 days. Not when the woman he loved had gone forever, and not when every room in this home still whispered her name, Rachel. She had once filled these cold walls with life, with classical music drifting through the mornings, bright laughter each afternoon, and the warm scent of baked goods and Sunday chicken stew on sunlit weekends. But now all that remained was the smell of rain, the scent of emptiness. John had always been the kind of man who could handle anything: tense negotiations, billion-dollar deals, even threats from the underworld. But how does one negotiate with grief? How does a father persuade a child to eat again when all she wants is for her mother to return? And that was where this story began, with a father slowly collapsing and a child sinking into silence, until a young woman in a small Brooklyn diner brought them something they thought had been lost forever: the taste of home and hope. In the dim kitchen, with nothing but the rain and the ticking of the wall clock, Jonathan stood motionless beside the cold bar counter, still holding a cup of coffee gone cold without knowing when it happened, the air thick and heavy like a damp blanket covering the entire apartment. On the sofa, little Lily remained curled up, clutching her teddy bear and an old family photo, her eyes wide yet hollow as though every emotion had been drained from her, and the plate of toast on the table had long since gone cold, untouched. Miss Davis, the longtime nanny, stepped in softly with a dish towel in hand, her voice low, though unable to hide her worry as she said that the little girl still had not eaten, and John did not answer, merely nodding as if he had already heard that news 3 times that day, though in truth it had been far more, and his throat tightened with no words left to offer. Each time he looked at Lily, he felt as though he were looking at a smaller, more fragile version of himself, a reflection slowly coming apart. It had been 4 months since Rachel's passing, a senseless car accident on a perfectly clear, sunny day at a familiar curve in the road, when she had been on her way home after dropping Lily off at school in the morning. Just 1 split second and a truck with failed brakes, and the police said she died instantly, with no chance to say goodbye, no opportunity to speak one last word of love. John did not know how to be a father alone. He only knew how to command, protect, and control. But true fatherhood was something entirely different. Something like sitting silently for hours just waiting for a nod, a glance, a tiny whisper from the daughter he loved more than his own life. Something like watching that child wither a little more each day without her mother beside her. And that was what was destroying him. It was not that he could not bear the pain, but that he was powerless. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Blake did not know what to do. And Lily's silence, like a wordless verdict, cut deeper into him with every passing second, while the rain outside continued to fall with the steady rhythm of a heavy, weary breath that seemed to echo the very heart of this story. I wanted to offer you, the one following the journey of loss and fragile hope between Jonathan and his daughter, a sincere message. If you can feel that quiet, aching sorrow, if your heart stirs even slightly at the small, lonely silhouette of Lily by the rain-fogged window, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video. Each small action from you helps this story travel farther, reaching hearts that might be in need of a little warmth on gray, rain-soaked days like these. Leave us a comment to let us know where you are watching from, which city, which corner of your room, or whichever place this story has found its way to you, because your words will tell us just how far the journey of John and Lily has gone, and that among the countless stories out there, this one has managed to find its way into your heart. Thank you for staying, for walking with us through these deeply emotional chapters. Miss Davis returned to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron before hesitating beside the dining table, her voice slow and steady. Trying to maintain composure, though, the worry etched deep into every wrinkle made it impossible to hide, as she said that the little girl still had not eaten, that she only stared out the window, that she had tried coaxing her with warm milk and even the pudding she loved, but nothing worked. Jonathan said nothing, standing before the coffee machine with vacant eyes fixed on the dark liquid dripping into the glass cup, the smell of coffee doing nothing to sharpen his thoughts as a blankness expanded inside his head, his body remaining upright and composed as always while everything within him seemed to be cracking apart layer by layer. He gave a small nod, an automatic reflex, then picked up the cup and walked into the living room where Lily sat in the same spot, wrapped tightly in a fur blanket with her bare feet curled together on the sofa, her gaze locked on the rain-soaked window as if she were waiting for something from the world beyond it. The family photo still resting unsteadily in her hand like a fragment of memory clinging to the edge of a storm. Jonathan set the cup down without a sound and took the seat opposite her, his eyes never leaving his daughter as he called her name, his voice low and gentle, but the little girl did not turn, did not move, only the slight rise and fall of her chest, showing she was still breathing, still here, even if her mind had wandered somewhere far away. A drop of water slid from her hair onto the photograph, and John reached out to wipe it away but froze halfway, the smallest gesture cutting into him, because Rachel had always been the one to brush the rain from Lily's hair, the one to straighten her collar, the one to soothe her with warm embraces, and he had never realized how helpless he was when it came to such simple things. He drew a deep breath, trying to push past the tightness in his throat, and reminded her softly that the doctor had said if she did not eat she would have to go to the hospital, that he did not want that to happen, that he was here and would do anything for her, though his final words dissolved almost completely into the air because he knew she was not listening, or if she heard, she no longer cared. In Lily's eyes he was no different than the chair beside her, not hated, not loved, merely unseen, as though her world had shifted entirely into shades of gray. "Miss," Davis quietly placed a small plate of food on the table next to Lily before slipping away, leaving father and daughter in a suffocating stillness, and Jonathan looked at the cold sandwich on the plate, suddenly seeing it as a symbol of his own helplessness. A man with wealth and authority and a full staff of nurses, specialists, and chefs who could not persuade a child to take one small bite. He had once used strategic brilliance to break corporations apart, had once forced the most stubborn opponents to concede. Yet now there was only a silent 6-year-old staring out the window and he had no power at all. Jonathan pressed his hand to his forehead and bent forward, the past days blurring together like a fog with no exit. And though he had not cried in years, refusing himself that vulnerability in the world he belonged to, looking at Lily now, a fragile little ghost, he felt a scream rising inside him. A pain with no place to go burned quietly through every cell of his body, while outside the rain continued without pause, tapping a mournful rhythm on the glass as if the whole sky were sharing the helplessness of a father who could do nothing but watch his daughter wither hour by hour. The room seemed to fall even more silent, if such a thing were possible, as Jonathan rose from his chair and walked to the bookshelf in the corner, a place he almost never touched, where the framed family photos that once served as sweet reminders on ordinary days had become sharp blades each time he passed them now. His hand drifted across the cold glass of each frame until his fingers paused on a photograph taken of the 3 of them in the autumn of the previous year, with Rachel standing in the center, her tilted smile gentle and her dark brown hair lifting in the breeze, while Lily, still round, cheeked and full of bright laughter back then, clung playfully to her mother's dress, and he, as always, lingered slightly behind them, his arm around his wife's shoulders, his gaze not on the camera but fixed on the 2 people who were his world, a fleeting moment holding an entire life he would never have again. He picked up the frame and brushed away the thin layer of dust gathering along its edges, his fingers trembling not from cold but from a rush of nameless emotion rising like floodwater behind a broken dam. When he set the photo back down, his hand accidentally struck another frame behind it, and the sound of shattering glass, soft though it was, exploded inside his mind as the wedding photo slipped and fell to the floor, the glass breaking into glittering shards scattered across the dim light, the image inside now slanted and unmoored among the fragments like their lives in this moment. It was their wedding picture, taken on a golden June day where she had worn a simple, elegant white dress and smiled with closed lips as she looked up at him. And he had once believed he did not deserve her, though she had never allowed him to feel that way, loving him with a tenderness as unwavering as if nothing in the world could shake her, being the only person who had ever called him a good man without even a hint of irony. Kneeling down, he carefully gathered the broken pieces of glass, the small cuts forming on his skin unnoticed, as his mind drifted back to the final morning, the morning that changed everything, when Rachel had awoken earlier than usual, wearing his oversized white shirt with bare feet on the wooden floor, stirring her usual cup of ginger tea, smiling at him when she caught him watching from the kitchen doorway, teasing him gently as she asked how long he planned to spy on her, And he had answered, "For the rest of my life if you let me," meaning every word. They had kissed in the quiet kitchen, where the faint scent of toasted bread lingered, and Lily had still been asleep, as she always was on Fridays, while Rachel mentioned she would take their daughter to school and stop by the flower shop for a few peonies to place on the dining table, hoping to soften the growing chill that had begun to creep into the house, as he buried himself too deeply in work, and they had held each other longer than usual, not knowing it would be the last time. Everything afterward had been a phone call from the hospital, sirens screaming inside his head, and the icy weight of her wedding ring being placed back into his palm like an unspoken ending. Now, as he looked back on it all, he could not understand how he was still standing, perhaps because of Lily, perhaps because some instinct within him had not yet allowed him to collapse entirely, though that did nothing to stop the quiet breaking spreading through every vein. Sitting down on the floor with the wedding photo in his hands, his vision blurred with tears he still refused to let fall, he found himself alone in an apartment that had once been warm like a home, but was now cold like a vast tomb, and in the center of it sat Jonathan Blake, the man who had once made the underworld of New York tread carefully, reduced now to a lost figure gathering the scattered pieces of a woman he could never forget. The phone rang just as Jonathan was trying to fit the photograph into a new frame, his hands still dusted with tiny specks of glass and the faint red scratches marking the tips of his fingers, and he looked up, his tired eyes drifting across the screen to the name of Lily's private doctor. He did not want to answer, did not want to hear another diagnosis or another warning, yet eventually, as though responsibility had been carved into his very bones, he took the call, listening to Dr. McKenna's gentle yet decisive voice, the voice of someone who had witnessed far too many parents insisting this is only a phase, as she explained that Lily was entering the early stage of acute malnutrition, that her small body was responding by shutting down energy and slowing its metabolism, and that if nothing changed within the next 24 to 36 hours, they would have no choice but to admit her for fluids and monitoring. She reminded him that children can endure more than adults sometimes believe, but Lily's emotional state was being pushed to its limit, and Jonathan gripped the phone hard against his ear, eyes shut as if bracing against a nameless storm, answering with a clipped "I understand," so short it bordered on cold, though she surely recognized the tempest inside his silence. He ended the call and the apartment sank back into quiet, the sky outside still heavy and gray, the rain refusing to let up. Rising slowly, he walked to the living room where Lily remained seated like a small statue, her back turned toward him, unmoving since morning, the pale light from the window casting a soft gray tint over her tousled dark hair, the worn photograph still in her hands with a thin crack across the corner from yesterday's fall. Jonathan knelt beside her without speaking, studying her up close, her face noticeably thinner, cheeks hollowed, faint shadows beneath her eyes, her skin washed out as though dusted with ash, and she did not look at him, had not looked at him since Rachel died, and sometimes he wondered whether, in her young mind, she held him partly responsible, the kind of unspoken judgment only silence can deliver more sharply than any cry. The doctor called, he said quietly, forcing calm into his voice, telling her that if she did not eat today or tomorrow she would have to go to the hospital, but she still gave no sign, so he continued in a low, nearly whispered tone, saying there was no mother there, no familiar bed, no teddy bear, only needles and machines beeping through the night. After a long moment, Lily blinked, very slowly, though she still did not turn, drawing deeper into her blanket and clutching the photograph to her chest like a shield between herself and the world. Jonathan felt his throat close as he wished he could lift her into his arms, hold her the way Rachel used to on restless nights, yet he no longer knew if he had the right to do that, and so he simply remained beside her, silent and powerless, while a fear colder and more merciless than any threat he had ever faced crept into his chest. Not fear of losing money or reputation or power, but fear of losing his only child in a slow, cruel unraveling, hour by hour, minute by minute, meal by meal. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on her small shoulder, just to confirm she was still there, whispering, "I'm sorry, Lily," the first time he had said those words since everything happened, admitting that he did not know what to do but promising he would find a way. And for the first time in days he saw her tiny shoulders tremble, not knowing whether it was emotion or a draft slipping through the window. Yet whatever it was, to Jonathan it was the first sign of life, and he knew that fragile as it was, he needed to hold on to it. Jonathan sat in the dimness of the living room, no longer able to distinguish the passing of time, the wall clock pointing toward 11. Yet no one in the apartment seemed to care how long lunch had passed or whether the light outside had shifted, while Lily remained curled up on the sofa with the blanket pulled up to her chin, her eyes wide open yet unfocused, drifting somewhere in an invisible space no one could reach. Jonathan rose, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, feeling as though he had run through every possible solution in his mind, with none strong enough to move his daughter, knowing the doctor had said hospitalization was necessary, yet also knowing that doing so would only drive Lily deeper into herself, something he could not allow. He walked into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out an old brown leather jacket he had not worn in years, a garment that reminded him of a past life spent on crowded streets, making sharp decisions without hesitation, though now his hand trembled as he pulled up the zipper, as if his entire body had forgotten what it felt like to leave this apartment. Returning to the living room, he knelt beside Lily and whispered that they should go out for a little while, receiving no response. But this time her eyelids flickered, and she glanced at him for the briefest second, a moment so small yet enough to confirm that he needed to do this, even if it had never been part of any plan. He went to find Miss Davis and told her to prepare Lily to go outside, to bring a warm coat and waterproof shoes, explaining that they would not go far, only change the air a little, and the older woman looked at him in surprise but asked no questions, knowing that once Mr. Blake made a decision, no one could sway him. About 15 minutes later, Lily was dressed in a thick moss-green coat with a knitted hat pulled halfway down her forehead, still holding the small teddy bear Rachel had sewn for her, and when Jonathan opened the door, the cold wind brushing his face made him shiver faintly, for this was the first time father and daughter had stepped out together since the funeral. The hallway leading to the elevator felt longer than usual, his footsteps echoing against the walls, and when the elevator doors opened, Lily reached for his hand, not tightly but just a light touch, one so gentle it caused his heart to tighten. Down in the lobby, the concierge greeted them, but Jonathan barely noticed, his mind far away, and outside the rain had stopped, though the air remained cold and damp, with puddles reflecting a gray horizon that made the city look as though it had just finished crying. He lifted Lily into his arms, and she did not resist, placing her in the back seat with careful hands as he buckled her in before circling around to the driver's seat, and as the car began to move he realized he had no destination in mind. New York streets appeared quieter than usual, its windows sliding past like frames in a muted gray film, and all he wanted was to escape, to leave behind the four walls that had been draining the life from his daughter. At every intersection he turned by instinct alone, without direction or schedule, with nothing but himself, Lily, and the quiet despair resting in the space between them, as the tall buildings receded behind them, replaced by smaller streets where the faint warmth of human presence still lingered through dim lights and worn-out storefronts. Jonathan did not know what was guiding him, but he did not stop, driven by the fragile hope that somewhere out there might exist something gentle enough, strange enough, different enough to reach his daughter's frozen heart, and he was willing to give up anything he had if it meant finding even the thinnest glimmer of that light. The rain returned just as they left Midtown, the droplets tapping against the windshield and streaming downward in steady lines beneath the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, the streetlights reflecting in blurred streaks across the soaked pavement, like faint threads of light dissolving into the dark. Jonathan drove slowly, both hands resting on the wheel out of habit, while his mind drifted far from the road ahead, for he had no destination, no map, no plan crafted with the precision that had once defined him. He only wanted to flee, as far as possible, from the cold stone walls and the empty rooms echoing with nothing but the remnants of laughter and the faded traces of familiar scents. Lily sat silent in the back seat, her head leaning against the window, eyes searching through the rain-streaked glass, as though trying to find something beyond the gray buildings, the downpour blurring everything, including memory itself, while the teddy bear Rachel had sewn lay in her lap, its fur worn and damp from the heavy air. When Jonathan glanced at the rearview mirror and caught sight of her small frame reflected there, his heart tightened, for she looked frighteningly fragile, like a thin sheet of paper that could dissolve at any moment into the thick curtain of rain swallowing the city. He no longer remembered how many streets he had turned down, or how many red lights he had passed, his hands guiding the wheel on instinct alone, while the rest of him felt hollow, and for a moment he considered driving back to the old house in the suburbs where they had lived when they were first married. But then he dismissed the thought, knowing every corner there echoed with Rachel's presence, and he did not trust himself to face wounds that had not yet begun to heal. At another moment he almost veered toward his office just to feel the illusion of control again, but the idea felt absurdly out of place now, when everything that had once mattered seemed meaningless. Beneath the dim lights of an old gas station he pulled over, not for fuel but simply to breathe, the rain thickening into heavier drops that drummed against the hood as though urging him to make a decision, though he had no idea what that decision should be. Lily remained silent. Jonathan turned to look at her again, and asked gently if she wanted anything to eat, receiving no response, her gaze still fixed outside with unblinking eyes and lips drawn tight as though speech itself had become foreign to her. The clock read nearly 6 in the evening, time slipping like silent grains of sand, and he started the engine again, pushing forward through the rain like someone swimming against the current of his own memories. The streets shifted as they entered deeper into Brooklyn, the tall buildings fading into rows of low red brick homes with scattered lights glowing in windows. And although Jonathan did not recognize this particular road, it did not matter. At a small intersection, a red light stopped him, and it was then he saw, to the right, a window glowing with warm golden light belonging to a tiny diner with no large sign, only a pane of glass decorated with old photographs and a handwritten chalkboard menu, and inside stood a small woman wiping down the wooden counter. Without fully understanding why, Jonathan steered toward the curb and parked in front of it, turning off the engine as the silence settled in the car with nothing but the steady patter of rain upon the glass. He looked at Lily, who did not speak, yet her eyes, just for a fleeting second, shifted toward that warm-lit window, so slightly it might have been missed, but to him it was a faint spark in the rain. And so he decided, perhaps for the first time and since that nightmare began, with something resembling hope, that they would step inside, not for food, not for any logical reason, but because something in his heart told him that there was something different in that place, something that might be warmth, or memory, or perhaps something he could not yet name, but something Lily might recognize. Outside, the rain still drifted in fine, soft threads, each drop sliding down the windshield like smudged ink on an unfinished letter, and Jonathan shut off the engine, looking into the small diner through the water-blurred glass, the wooden sign above the window barely visible beneath the warm yellow light that revealed the faded hand-painted letters reading Maggie's table, the white paint chipped by time. Through the low front window he could see the silhouettes of elderly patrons sitting quietly over steaming mugs of coffee, a few crooked black and white photos hanging on the faded cream walls, and the long wooden counter where a young woman was wiping a small vase with a cloth. Jonathan turned toward Lily, who remained silent, yet her eyes were no longer drifting or empty. She gazed at the diner as though glimpsing something from an old dream, and with just the slightest movement of her eyes he knew he should step out. He got out first, opened the back door, and offered his hand, and Lily neither resisted nor refused, placing her small palm into his, cold but steady. Jonathan knelt to straighten her knitted hat, pulled the zipper of her coat up to her chin, then lifted her into his arms with a slow, careful motion, as though afraid of breaking the fragile moment of peace unfolding around them. They entered the diner as the small bell above the door chimed softly, a gentle sound strangely out of place in a city filled with noise, yet here ringing like a quiet greeting, and the warmth from inside fogged Jonathan's glasses slightly, while he set Lily down, the child still clutching the worn teddy bear, and looking around with wide eyes as if trying to recall a familiar scent drifting in the air. And indeed the room carried something like Rachel, not exactly the same, but uncannily close. The aroma of melted butter on baked crusts, slow simmered vegetables, the warm scent of aged wood touched by time, and a hint of cinnamon and nutmeg dissolving gently into the air. An older woman with soft silver curls behind the counter looked up and offered a kind smile, remarking that anyone who ventured out in this rain must be in need of something warm, and Jonathan nodded without speaking before choosing a small table by the window where they could look out at the street. Lily climbed onto the chair, her feet not reaching the floor, but for the first time since her mother's death she lifted her head to take in the room around her, not tense or guarded but simply curious, as though a child long accustomed to cold rooms had suddenly been placed in a space filled with warm light and soft voices. A young woman approached with a notebook and pen in hand, her hair tied neatly back and her face untouched by makeup, offering a gentle greeting and asking what they would like to have, her tone not just polite but deeply kind, as if welcoming someone who had finally returned after many years. Jonathan had not yet answered when Lily looked up and, for the first time in many days, spoke, saying softly that her mother used to bake things that smelled like this, and though the words were almost too quiet to hear, his heart heard them clearly. Jonathan glanced at the young woman, Emily, and saw not only surprise in her eyes but understanding, and without asking further she smiled and told Lily she would bring out the special dish of the day, because perhaps the little girl would recognize the familiar scent, then walked away, leaving father and daughter in a silence no longer cold. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, feeling for the first time in a long time that he did not have to hold the entire world together by force, And although he did not know what awaited them beyond this moment, here in a small Brooklyn diner called Maggie's Table, he felt something shifting, slowly, gently, but undeniably real. And Lily's eyes, following Emily's movements behind the counter, were no longer entirely the eyes of a child losing her faith in the world. Emily returned to the table a few minutes later, carrying a small wooden tray holding 2 steaming bowls of soup and a serving of golden baked pie sprinkled lightly with chopped herbs, placing the plate before Lily with slow, careful movements that made no sound louder than the rain falling outside, as she explained in a gentle voice that the dish was the diner's own recipe, a homemade meat and vegetable pie with tender stew inside and a crisp crust, inviting the little girl to taste it and see whether it resembled the flavor her mother used to make, her eyes touching Lily's only briefly before drifting away, offering no pressure and expecting nothing. Jonathan watched the young woman cautiously, yet he could not help noticing the strange warmth she brought into the space around them, a stark contrast to the penthouse on the 38th floor, where everything was so perfect it felt lifeless, for at Maggie's table there were no expensive chairs, only old wooden seats with chipped paint and tabletops scratched by time, details that made the place feel alive. Instead of modern art like the ones decorating his apartment, the walls here displayed family photographs, faded Christmas cards, and children's drawings taped up in bright strips of colored adhesive, and in one corner stood a small shelf crammed with worn novels and cooking magazines, beside a reading lamp casting a soft amber glow. This diner did not try to be elegant or remarkable. It was simply real and close enough to touch. Jonathan glanced at Lily, who was staring intently at the pie before her, her eyes no longer empty but filled with something unnamed, a look he had not seen since the day Rachel died. Not quite a spark, but a noticeable shift of emotion. Emily said no more, stepping quietly away and leaving them alone with their food and the room's gentle warmth. Jonathan lifted his spoon, tasted a small sip of soup, and the rich flavors spread across his tongue, stirring memories of family dinners where Rachel would tell stories and Lily would drop her spoon and burst into laughter, a sharp ache piercing his chest, not to break him but to remind him he was still alive, still here, still capable of feeling. He set the spoon down and looked at his daughter, gently asking whether she wanted to try, and though she did not answer, she did not turn away. Instead, her small hand slowly lifted the spoon, trembling slightly as she scooped a bit of the pie's filling, lifted it to her nose to smell, her eyes widening just a fraction before she tasted a tiny bite. And though no one spoke, and there was no applause, a door opened inside Jonathan's heart. He wanted to ask Emily where she learned the recipe, who had taught her to cook it, but instead he simply watched her move behind the counter, arranging cups as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though he knew she had achieved what no doctor, therapist, or caretaker had been able to do. She made Lily eat. She made his daughter respond. On a cold, rainy afternoon in Brooklyn, in a small diner with a young waitress named Emily, the impossible had happened, and Jonathan, a man who once believed he could control the entire world, felt his heart soften before a gentleness he could neither predict nor explain, something faint beginning to kindle within him amid the warmth, the scent of hot soup, the chime of the doorbell, and the quiet kindness of a young woman who did not know she had just altered the fate of a breaking family. Jonathan had expected nothing when he stepped into that little diner except a place to hide from reality, a small refuge before he would have to face the truth that his daughter was slowly slipping beyond his reach, and he certainly did not believe that a single meal could work any miracle, for he had tried everything in the past days, from coaxing to threats, from tears to silence, and none of it had mattered. So when Emily placed the chicken pot pie before Lily, the warm steam rising from its golden crust, drifting gently into the air, Jonathan simply watched in quiet resignation, his heartbeat slow, neither hoping nor expecting, only enduring. But then he saw those small shoulders shift just the faintest movement as Lily seemed to draw in a deeper breath, her eyelids flickering, not with drowsiness or distraction as in previous days, but as though some long-buried memory had been stirred awake. She leaned forward slightly, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the table, moving closer to the scent that floated upward, a familiar aroma she could not name yet, one that carried blurred images of a warm kitchen, soft laughter, and late Sunday afternoons when her mother bustled around the stove while she sat waiting for her favorite dish, chicken pot pie, baked by tender hands and a smile caught in the amber light of late evening. And each time her mother cut into the first slice, steam and rich fragrance filled the home. And now, in a small, unfamiliar diner in a vast city, that dish resurfaced like a quiet miracle. Lily looked up at Jonathan, her eyes wide, saying nothing, but within that gaze was a silent question, as if she were asking for permission to believe this was not a dream, and Jonathan nodded softly, the gesture delicate as a whisper. Lily lifted the spoon, her hand trembling as though she feared the moment would vanish the instant she tasted it. But when the spoon touched her lips and then her tongue, her eyes closed and a faint sound escaped from deep in her throat, and she took another bite, then another, not hurriedly or hungrily, but as though each spoonful carried her across memories. Jonathan did not move, sitting frozen, his eyes fixed on his daughter, every sense sharpened to capture each second as though terrified it might slip away. For this was the first time Lily had eaten anything since Rachel died, and not from hunger or force, but because she wanted to, because the dish had touched the deepest place in her small, fractured heart. Emily stood behind the counter pretending to polish glasses, but she kept glancing in their direction, and when she saw Lily take that first bite she paused for a heartbeat before continuing, though her eyes glowed, just slightly, with the quiet knowledge of the significance of something that might seem simple. Jonathan looked toward her, and for the first time that evening their eyes met, and though no words were exchanged, something formed between them, a silent acknowledgement that among all the chaos, moments of tenderness still existed and could save what was breaking. When Lily reached her 5th bite, then her 6th, Jonathan nearly broke down, but he held it back as he always did, not wanting to disturb the fragile calm surrounding them. Yet this time, within that calm, he no longer felt alone. Jonathan could barely breathe as he watched Lily lift a 3rd spoonful, then a 4th, each movement still slow and tentative as though she were finding her way through darkness, and with every bite she raised to her lips he felt his own heart pulled back from the edge by a single beat. For days he had grown accustomed to seeing his daughter sit motionless, her eyes dull and distant, rejecting any attempt at reaching her, and now, suddenly, before his very eyes, she was eating, not because she was forced, not because of medication or a therapist's guidance, but because she chose to, and even the smallest choice was a sign of life. He did not understand what was happening, whether it was the food, the space, or the waitress who had brought it, and when he lowered his gaze to the old ceramic plate before him, he noticed for the first time the delicate detail along its rim, tiny cracks mended carefully with lines of gold paint, the kind of kintsugi repair Rachel had once loved, and she used to say that things which had been broken and repaired with love were more precious than when they were whole, a thought that tightened his throat. He looked back at Lily, still eating slowly but steadily, each spoonful like a breath returning to her small body, her face still guarded, yet her eyes carrying something new, a faint light, a subtle stirring like ripples across a still pond. Jonathan felt as though he were standing at the edge of a miracle, witnessing something too fragile, too beautiful to touch, his hand gripping the table so he would not tremble, for he had lost too much Rachel, the sense of peace, the control that had once defined him, and throughout this time what terrified him most was not grief but helplessness, the helplessness of failing to reach the child whose emptiness grew heavier each day. Yet now, in some way he could not fathom, a sliver of that darkness had been torn open, not by him, but by something far beyond his understanding. A dish, a scent, a simple diner with soft jazz drifting from an old speaker in the corner, and a young woman with eyes warm as early winter sunlight. Jonathan did not understand, and that confusion unsettled him, for he was a man accustomed to explanations, to predicting risk, reading faces, analyzing outcomes within seconds, and now, confronted with the one thing that had coaxed his daughter into choosing to connect with the world again, he was completely lost. He had no idea why that pie tasted exactly like the one Rachel used to bake, why Lily responded to it, why this place, this person, this precise moment mattered, and he had no desire to break the moment with questions. He only wanted to hold on to it, breathe with it, until he was sure he was not dreaming. Lily had eaten nearly half the serving when she finally stopped, leaning back as though exhausted from a long journey, saying nothing but keeping her eyes open, as she stared through the window where the rain still fell in gentle strands, and Jonathan remained silent, watching her with his heart still unsteady, sensing something both unfamiliar and strangely familiar rising within him, not joy, not relief, but a quiet emotion, like standing before a forest beginning to grow back after being burned, everything still raw and ruined, yet the first green shoots already visible, enough to keep hope alive. Jonathan remained seated as Lily leaned her head against the back of the chair, her expression quiet, as though she had just traveled a long distance inside her own mind, while his own breath had yet to find its normal rhythm, and when he glanced toward the counter where Emily was speaking softly with an older customer ordering more coffee, he noticed the way she bowed her head slightly, her smile neither wide nor performative, simply warm and true. There was a gentleness in the way she existed in that space, as if she were not an employee nor the owner, but the very soul holding the diner in its fragile peace. And Jonathan could not remember the last time he had noticed a stranger this way since Rachel's death. It was not because Emily was beautiful or outwardly striking, but because of the way she observed the world, the way she refrained from intruding, asking questions, or disrupting the private sphere between him and his daughter, yet managed to remain present as though she instinctively knew when to step forward and when to step back. He could not understand how someone so young could possess such depth of empathy, for her eyes, when she looked at Lily, held none of the pitying softness adults often wear when facing a grieving child. No hollow sympathy or rehearsed encouragement, only a look of quiet understanding, as though she herself had walked through loss or had witnessed it from very close. Jonathan found himself replaying every detail since they had entered the diner, the way Emily never asked names, never pried, only observed and acted, the way she had chosen the exact dish Lily once loved most, prepared in the exact way, carrying the exact scent, and how she had not shown surprise when Lily took the first bite, had not celebrated excessively, every reaction measured with the restraint of someone shaped by experience. It left him both curious and unsettled, for he was not accustomed to a kind of understanding that required no explanation. In his world, every action had a motive, every outcome a calculation, every emotion a pattern to be read, yet Emily remained an unknown, leaving no trace yet creating something he himself had been unable to connection. When Lily drifted into sleep in the chair with her small hand still clutching the teddy bear, Jonathan stood and walked to the counter, and Emily looked up without surprise, as though she had known he would approach. He did not know how to begin, and managed only a simple statement, telling her she had done what he could not, and Emily tilted her head, not smiling but letting sincerity rise in her eyes as she said it was not her, but the food, the memory, the love that once lived inside it. The words stunned him, for she neither claimed credit nor feigned modesty, speaking instead as though stating a simple truth, which made her seem even more unusual. He looked more closely at the small board behind the counter where the day's menu was written, and noticed for the first time the name of the dish, written in gentle script, with a line beneath it that read, "Grandmother's recipe, for hearts finding their way home." He lifted his gaze and quietly asked if she had cooked it, and Emily nodded, saying she had learned it from her grandmother, who once made that same dish for a single mother living nearby when Emily was a child, that they had been very close, and perhaps that was why she knew exactly how the flavor should be. At those words, Jonathan felt his heart tighten. The mention of a woman, a single mother, this recipe. The grandmother words brushing against a memory he could not yet identify, though he asked nothing more, not because he did not want to, but because he sensed he needed time to gather the fragments that had surfaced. Emily said nothing else, turning to prepare tea for another customer, yet their eyes had met long enough for him to feel the invisible thread between them draw a little tighter, and for a man who had long survived in a world devoid of softness, that connection startled him more than anything else. The next day, Jonathan brought Lily back to Maggie's table, making no promises and expecting no miracle to repeat itself, yet something in the way his daughter's eyes shifted. When he suggested it made it impossible for him to ignore. Lily did not say yes, but she picked up her coat on her own, walked to the door by herself, and held her worn teddy bear tight in her arms, the first time since Rachel's death that she had stepped out of the apartment without needing persuasion. When they arrived, the diner looked exactly as it had before, its quiet warmth undisturbed, the faint scent of baked crust lingering in the air, the soft clink of spoons against ceramic bowls, an elderly diner chuckling gently at something a familiar server said, and Emily wiping the counter, lifting her head to greet them with a smile that made it seem as though they had never been gone as she whispered a soft welcome back. Jonathan simply nodded and pulled out Lily's chair, and the little girl settled into the same seat where she had taken her first bite of chicken pot pie after days of silence. Emily did not ask what they wanted to order. She slipped into the kitchen, and minutes later returned with another steaming serving of chicken pot pie, and this time, before Jonathan could speak, Lily lifted the spoon herself, taking a small bite and smiling softly as the warm filling melted on her tongue, a genuine smile, unforced and unguarded, delicate but powerful enough to make Jonathan's heart tighten with emotion. In the days that followed, Jonathan rearranged his schedule so he could bring Lily to Maggie's table each afternoon, not as an obligation but as a ritual they could not afford to lose. At first they simply ate and left, but gradually Lily began to speak more, asking Emily small questions like what she was cooking today, when she had learned to cook, or what the cat in the wall painting was named, and Emily always answered with the gentle cadence of someone telling a bedtime story. Some days she let Lily sit behind the counter wearing a tiny apron and taught her how to slice apples, and Jonathan sat at a nearby table without interfering, quietly watching, each of Lily's smiles stitching another piece back into his heart. It seemed the little girl had not only found her appetite again, but had also found a place to breathe, to exist, to be herself without the burden of grief pressing against her chest. Emily never acted overly concerned, yet her eyes rested on Lily long enough to understand how the child felt. And one afternoon when Lily slipped slightly on a towel on the floor, Jonathan had not even risen from his chair before Emily reached her, not frantic, simply steady, helping her up and asking gently if she was hurt, offering no smothering embraces or excessive comfort, only the presence of someone who understood that children needed trust rather than pity. After that day, Lily began to seek Emily the moment she stepped inside, and one afternoon she brought her a messy little drawing, a small house with smoke rising from the chimney, and a long-haired woman baking inside. Emily accepted the picture with both hands, her eyes going still for a few seconds before she bowed her head in gratitude as though she had been given something priceless. Jonathan, sitting behind his cup of black coffee, said nothing, but he knew a part of Lily's heart had found a place to rest, and he realized that he, too, had begun to anticipate those Brooklyn afternoons, their gentle rain, and the small diner that had become a fragile bridge between past and present, between a man slowly learning to let go of control and a little girl learning to smile again after loss. And at the center of it all stood a young woman with gentle eyes and hands that somehow knew how to mend what no one else could touch. One late afternoon, after the rain had finally stopped, the soft, fading sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm golden sheen across the wooden floor, while Lily sat at the corner of the table with her watercolor set, quietly humming a children's tune whose melody barely lingered in the air, and Jonathan sat beside her, watching her as though he had never seen such gentle light return to her face. Emily arrived carrying an extra cup of cocoa for Lily and a mug of tea for him, then settled into the chair across from them as if the distance of strangers no longer existed among the three, and something in the atmosphere that day wrapped them in such rare stillness that none of them spoke for a long time, each unwilling to disturb the fragile peace settling over wounds that had not yet healed. Jonathan set his cup down and looked at Emily as an invitation to conversation, asking whether she had always lived in Brooklyn, and slowly they drifted into memories of her childhood. She told him she grew up in this very neighborhood in her grandmother's old 3-story house, that her parents had died young and her grandmother had raised her with homemade meals, stories told during rainstorms, and lessons about kindness. She said her grandmother had cared for many people in the community, and there had been one woman in particular she was fond of, named Rachel, a young single mother whom she had helped briefly many years ago. Emily explained that before Rachel disappeared without a word, she had left behind this handwritten recipe as her only way of saying thank you, and her grandmother had kept it safe ever since. Jonathan's heart stopped for a beat at the sound of that name, Rachel, and he swallowed, steadying his expression while Emily continued unaware, her voice soft with distant fondness as she described how Rachel had had a small daughter, a well-behaved, quiet child who rarely spoke but always smiled while eating that dish. Emily explained that she had been younger than that little girl and did not play with her often, but she remembered her grandmother once telling her that food made with love could heal even the most broken hearts. Jonathan could no longer sit still. He leaned back, his fingers tightening around his teacup as his gaze locked on Emily's face, the fragmented pieces of old memory shifting inside him. Rachel had once mentioned briefly that she had lived in Brooklyn before moving to Manhattan, but she had never spoken much about her past, about what had happened before they met, and Jonathan had known she had been a single mother, but Rachel had never shared any detail about her first child. Now her name resurfaced through the memory of a young woman sitting before him, here in this small diner, with a recipe uncannily identical and a tenderness in her eyes that felt hauntingly familiar, as though she carried an understanding of the pain Lily bore. His voice low and rough, he asked if she remembered Rachel's last name, and Emily shook her head, saying her grandmother had only ever called her Rachel, that she had been too young to notice more, but she remembered her grandmother saying Rachel had suddenly left without explanation, leaving behind only a postcard of thanks with no return address. Jonathan nodded slowly, a rising tangle of emotion stirring within him, not merely surprise or curiosity, but a deeper tremor at the thought that the past might be threading its way back to him through people he had never expected. He looked at Emily longer than he intended, as though searching her eyes for answers she did not know she possessed. Yet she simply sat there, sincere and unassuming, unaware that her story had just cracked open a door he had long kept shut. And in that moment, Jonathan began to suspect that perhaps, just perhaps, Emily was not merely a young woman who knew how to cook and loved children, but part of a thread that had never truly broken, a remnant of Rachel's life he had never known, returning now not loudly, not with warning, but softly, like the warm scent of chicken pot pie drifting out of an old kitchen from years long gone. 2 days after his conversation with Emily, Jonathan drove alone to Haven Pines, a nursing home tucked in a quiet southern corner of Brooklyn, where narrow streets were lined with maple trees already turning color, and on the way he did not play music or turn on the radio, his mind repeating only one name over and over, Martha. He had spent the entire previous evening searching through city archives to find that name based on the faint thread Emily had offered, and now his heart beat in a strange rhythm, part anticipation, part fear of discovering something too immense to contain. A nurse on duty led him down a long hallway paneled with old wood, the faint scent of eucalyptus drifting in the air, and Martha was sitting by the window with a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, the late afternoon light slanting across her features in a way that softened the age in her face, as though time had left behind a trace of kindness in every wrinkle. Jonathan approached and introduced himself softly as a friend of Rachel, and the moment that name left his lips, the old woman stiffened slightly, her cloudy eyes sharpening as though a long sleeping memory had stirred awake. She looked at Jonathan for a long moment before nodding slowly, as if his words were unlocking something buried deep within her. She spoke in a rough, deliberate voice, each word pulled from the past with effort, telling him that Rachel had been one of the strongest women she had ever known, arriving when she was very young with a little girl of about 3, with no husband, no family, no belongings, only a pair of eyes that always seemed to be fleeing from something. Jonathan sat completely still, as each sentence threaded into the empty spaces Rachel had never allowed him to see. Martha told him she had let them stay on the second floor of her old house, that Rachel worked in a laundromat by day and cooked dinner for her in the evenings, and every weekend, she made chicken pot pie so delicious that Martha could still remember the taste after all these years. She paused, looked out the window, then continued slowly, explaining that one night Rachel had vanished without a word, leaving only a letter tucked beneath a picture frame on the kitchen table, and in that letter she wrote that she had no choice but to leave to protect her daughter. Jonathan felt his throat tighten as he asked, almost whispering, if she remembered the little girl's name, and Martha nodded without hesitation, saying her name had been Isabel, a quiet child with extraordinary eyes just like her mother's, and she had always believed that Rachel lived with a deep, real fear, that she had once told her if anything happened she should trust that everything she did was for Isabel. Jonathan closed his eyes for a few seconds, as a flood of unnameable emotion rose inside him. For Isabel was a name Rachel had never spoken even once during the years they lived together. He had never known she had a child before him. Now fragments of the truth were drawing together. Isabel, she could very well be Emily. He asked Martha if she had ever seen Isabel again after Rachel left, and the old woman shook her head, saying she had not. But about 2 years later, she received a postcard from a girl who signed her name Emily, thanking her for helping her mother, and she assumed Rachel had changed the girl's name or entrusted her to someone else to keep her hidden, perhaps protecting her from a past that was dangerous. Jonathan rose and gently held Martha's hand, thanking her, telling her that what she had shared meant more than she knew, and she squeezed his hand and smiled softly, saying that if he was the man Rachel had chosen to give her heart to, then she believed she had chosen well. When Jonathan left the nursing home, the Brooklyn evening wind swept fiercely across his coat, yet he no longer felt cold. Inside him swirled the weight of new truths, old suspicions, and a question slowly turning into belief. Emily might very well be Isabel, the daughter Rachel had once been forced to leave behind. And if that was true, then their meeting had never been coincidence, it was destiny. Jonathan did not leave the nursing home right away, but returned to Martha's room after giving himself a moment to breathe, sensing there was something more, a deeper thread in her memory that would only surface if she allowed herself to open the door to it. When he stepped back inside, she was still sitting by the window, her gaze resting somewhere beyond the glass as though speaking to someone long gone. And before he could say anything, she began to speak, her voice lower than before, slower, weighted with the gravity of something buried for far too long. Rachel had not been a woman simply fleeing hardship. She had been running from a world no one should ever touch if they hoped to remain whole. Martha told him that one late night, while she was washing dishes in the kitchen, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her face drained of color, eyes wide with panic, clutching Isabel so tightly, it looked as if she feared someone might steal the child right out of her arms. She whispered, not crying, but each word striking with the force of a blade. Rachel said she had betrayed a powerful man, one she had once loved but who had turned her life into a kind of hell. A man who would not let her go, who would never allow her to build a different life. When she fled that world with her daughter, he had hunted her relentlessly. Rachel had changed her name multiple times, moving from city to city, living under the constant shadow of fear. Only when she reached Brooklyn and happened to meet Martha on a rainy afternoon while searching for shelter, did she dare let Isabel sleep through a night undisturbed. But that peace did not last. Rachel learned from someone she once trusted that a man was coming to New York looking for her, not a police officer, not a lawyer, but an enforcer from a mafia family. Martha did not press for details. She only remembered how violently Rachel's hands trembled. Rachel told her that if she stayed any longer, Isabel would no longer be safe, for she had seen what they were capable of doing to those who tried to leave. The following night, Rachel took Isabel to a small church and placed her in a protective adoption program under a new name, leaving a letter for the adoptive family with only one plea: please love this child as if she were your own. She returned afterward, pretending everything was fine, but Martha had seen the light vanish from her eyes, the hollow look of a mother who had severed her own soul to save her child from a darkness she herself could not escape. A week later, Rachel disappeared without a farewell, leaving behind only the chicken pot pie recipe tucked inside an old cookbook and a short letter thanking Martha for showing her what home felt like. Jonathan could not move. His heart pounded heavily as if each of Martha's words were being etched into him with fire. Everything he thought he had known about Rachel now seemed like only the smallest fragment of a life filled with complexities she had chosen to carry alone. And Isabel, the little girl torn from her mother so she could survive, might now be Emily, the young woman who had cracked open Lily's frozen grief with the very dish that had once soothed her own childhood. He understood why Rachel had never spoken of it. She had tried to shield him, their daughter, and even herself from a past soaked in danger. Jonathan gently held Martha's frail hand, his eyes burning. Do you think Isabel knows who she really is? Martha slowly shook her head. I do not know, she said softly, but I believe there are truths of blood that do not need to be spoken to find their way home. They return through memory, through taste, through gestures learned before a child can even understand them. The way Emily makes that pie, she does not need to be taught. It has lived inside her all her life. Jonathan rose, thanked her, and walked out. But his heart was no longer the same. He left not only with the fragments of Rachel's hidden past, but with a new responsibility, a truth waiting to be revealed, and the understanding that what lay ahead of him was not simply a reunion, but an act of forgiveness, of healing, and of finally facing the unfinished things love had left behind. Jonathan left the nursing home with heavy steps, as though the air around him had thickened under the weight of what he had just learned, and the cold wind brushing across his face carried the scent of wilted grass and moisture. Yet he felt nothing except the echo of the name Isabel repeating endlessly in his mind. Rachel had once had a daughter before she came into his life, a truth that struck like a blow to everything he thought he had known about the woman he loved. He did not feel anger or betrayal, but a deep, staggering disorientation, as though he had stepped into a different world where all familiar things had been turned upside down. Why had she hidden that from him? Why had she never once spoken of the little girl she had left behind during all the years they lived together? Was it because she feared he would not accept it? Or because the pain of losing Isabel was too great for her to confront, too unbearable to shape into words? Jonathan had no answers. He only knew that now everything he had sensed about Emily began aligning in ways too sharp and too precise to ignore. The way she looked at Lily had never been the gaze of a stranger. It was the gaze of someone who had once been a child grieving her own mother. The way she cooked that dish, perfectly, without a single variation, as though its flavor lived in her bones. And the quiet sorrow he had seen in her eyes, a still, deep hurt, more like a scar than a passing sadness, suddenly made sense. He had once thought it was empathy, the sensitivity of someone who understood loss. Now he wondered if it was memory, the memory of a child taken from her mother in the darkness, renamed, sent away, and raised with a hollow no comfort could fill. Emily could be Isabel. Every part of him resisted the thought because it felt too unreal, too sudden, yet every piece of evidence pointed to one truth. Emily was likely the child Rachel had once loved, protected, and been forced to give up. And if that was true, he was not simply looking at an untouched past, but at an entire branch of Rachel's life he had never imagined he would cross. He remembered the way Emily spoke to Lily, kneeling to meet the child's eyes, not pretending to understand but truly listening, standing steady in moments when most adults would rush in with pity, giving Lily a sense of safety, of being seen. That was not mere kindness. It was instinct, the instinct of someone who had longed for that same tenderness once upon a time. Jonathan pulled the car to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel as though it could hold back the flood rising inside him. He did not know whether Rachel had ever intended to tell him. Perhaps she had tried, then grew afraid. Perhaps she had believed time would offer another chance, but time had not. And now he carried that final piece of her story, along with the responsibility it brought not only for Lily, but for Emily. She had a right to know, yet how could he say it? How could he shatter the world she had built with a truth both beautiful and devastating? He had no answer. He only knew that from this moment on, he could no longer see Emily as a stranger. She was not simply the young woman who helped Lily take her first bite, not just the gentle server in a small neighborhood diner. She was a part of Rachel, the most living remembrance the woman he loved had left in this world. And she was also the next chapter destiny had laid before him, and Lily, not by coincidence, but by design. Jonathan spent nearly a week drifting through sleepless nights, and for the first time in many years he could not focus on a single piece of work. Unfinished contracts, canceled meetings, phone calls from partners answered with distant, distracted replies, all of it pushed aside by the circling thoughts of Rachel, of Isabel, and of Emily. Beneath it all was a growing pull toward the truth, a need to trace the story Rachel had buried, not out of anger but out of love and a grief he still had no name for. He hired a private investigator, not the old-fashioned shadowing type, but someone who had once worked within the state adoption system, someone who understood how impossible it was to find a new identity among millions of records, like searching for a needle in an ocean. But Jonathan was a man of resolve, of capability, and of connections that rarely failed. 3 days later, he had a name: Emily Vance, living right here in Brooklyn, New York, 26 years old, listed as the owner of an old residence inherited from her grandmother, unmarried, living a life so modest it bordered on invisible. Little presence on social media, few social circles, but her academic and professional record steady and precise, as though someone had once taught her how to live safely in a world that could wound. What Jonathan could not pull his eyes from was the last attached photograph, a distant, slightly blurred picture but clear enough to capture her gaze, a gaze touched by the same gentle loneliness he had often seen in Rachel's eyes. The tilt of her head, her small frame, a smile that kept people at ease without letting them too close. Isabel, then Emily. A new name for a new life. Jonathan held the picture for a long time, trying to imagine what Rachel would say if she were still alive. Would she cry? Would she blame him for digging into wounds she had fought to bury? Or would she thank him for finding the piece of herself she had believed lost forever? He did not know. He only knew now that every sign pointed to Emily, and yet, ironically, the moment he found what he had been searching for, he hesitated. Was it because he feared that if confirmed, Emily would no longer be Emily but someone burdened with a past too heavy to carry? Or was it because he feared upsetting the fragile balance between them, between the young woman and Lily, between her and himself? He considered reaching out to Emily, even wrote a short, respectful letter. But each night he reread it and tore it up, wondering how one could write to someone and say, "I believe you are the daughter of the woman I once loved, the woman who died and left behind another child who now calls me father." And how could he face Emily's eyes if he were wrong, if she were not Isabel, if this was all a cruel coincidence of fate? During those days, Jonathan visited Maggie's table only once. He sat at a distance, watching Emily wipe down tables, tease Lily, laughing when the little girl pretended to drop her spoon just to have Emily pick it up. In that moment he realized some answers do not need to be spoken. Some truths exist with or without confirmation. Emily did not need to know who she was to become someone essential to him and to his daughter. And perhaps real love meant accepting someone not because of their past but because of who they were right now. So Jonathan kept the photograph, placed it in a small compartment of his personal safe, choosing not to disturb the peace fate had woven. He was not ready, and perhaps he might never truly be ready. But he knew that if someday Emily asked if she opened the door to her blurred, half-remembered dreams, he would be the one willing to tell her the rest of the story with all the softness Rachel had once believed he could offer to those she loved. On a late Saturday afternoon at the very edge of spring, the air still crisp yet gentle enough for Jonathan to bring Lily out of the penthouse that no longer felt cold now that their days often led them back to Maggie's table, the diner was quietly warm, sunlight slanting through the large front window and casting a soft golden glow over the corner table where Lily sat doodling with colored pencils, while Jonathan watched her with a cooling cup of coffee in his hands. Emily stepped out from the kitchen, carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies fragrant with butter and sugar, and she set it down gently before smiling at Lily, then turned as if to walk away when Jonathan quietly called her back. "Would you sit for a moment?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a plea rather than a request. Emily paused, surprised for a breath, but then pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her brown eyes warmed by the quiet willingness to listen. Jonathan studied her for a moment, the angled sunlight catching on the loose curls in her hair, and though he did not know where to begin, he knew with clarity that he could no longer carry his gratitude in silence. "I used to think I was someone who could control everything," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "Work, time, crises, even emotions. But then Rachel died, and Lily, she just fell apart. I thought I could fix it, pull her back, but the harder I tried, the more helpless I became." Emily did not interrupt. She simply held his gaze with a tenderness that did not rush or intrude. "Until we met you," Jonathan continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I cannot explain why a single meal, a single smile, a light touch on the shoulder could make Lily open up again. She didn't just eat, she began to live again. And I did too." Emily swallowed, her hands folding quietly in her lap. "I didn't do anything special, John," she whispered. "I just cooked." "No," Jonathan said gently but firmly, shaking his head. "You didn't just cook. You brought back something Lily and I had lost. You let us feel something real again, something close, something no one else could have given." Emily's eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. "There are days," she said softly, "when I feel like an outsider looking in. I see people with families, with memories, with bonds. I'm not sure I ever understood. But with Lily, I feel something. Not clear, not easy to explain, but real." Jonathan nodded, his heart tightening at her words. He wanted to tell her that perhaps what she sensed was not imagination at all, that there might be a deeper connection woven into her without her knowing. A thread leading back to Rachel, and a life she had been taken from but not today. Not when her heart had only just found enough warmth to reach toward something gentle. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said slowly, "but I do know one thing. From the day you stepped into our world, everything began to change. And if you're willing, I'd like to take you to dinner. Not here, not where you work. Somewhere else. Just the two of us. No chicken pot pie, no little hands tugging at your apron. I want to thank you properly. And perhaps tell you a story about a woman who would have loved to meet you. Just a simple dinner. No pressure." Emily looked at him, and something shifted softly in her gaze. Not surprise, not confusion, but quiet acceptance. She nodded, a small, gentle nod that needed no further explanation. From the corner of the table, Lily looked up, half a cookie in her mouth, her eyes bright as though she understood without needing words. She giggled, then bent back over her picture, a drawing of 3 figures standing beneath sunlight, with a crooked line of writing above them that read, "Family smells like baked goods." And in that moment, Jonathan knew that none of this was about grief anymore. Everything unfolding now was about rebirth, undramatic, unhurried, just a warm pulse returning to a heart once shattered, because someone had stepped in at the right moment with the gentleness of a spoon lifted to a child's mouth, and the quiet sincerity needed to save a man who once thought he had run out of feelings to give. That Sunday, the sun was gentle, no longer carrying the long gray heaviness of winter rain, yet not quite belonging to spring, and Jonathan sat in his armchair with a steaming cup of coffee beside him, watching Lily in the middle of the living room, surrounded by sheets of paper, colored pencils, and a few broken crayons. She had begun to talk more, laugh more, eat better, and most of all, she no longer avoided his eyes whenever he mentioned her mother. But today she said nothing. She simply drew with a quiet focus, as if each stroke of her pencil were a tiny thread stitching together the torn pieces of memory inside her small heart. When Lily finished, she did not hand the drawing to Jonathan right away, but set it on the table and stepped back with her arms folded, as though waiting for some unspoken reaction. Jonathan walked over and leaned down to look. It was a simple kitchen, not detailed, not elaborate, but warm enough that he could almost feel the heat from the imaginary oven. A tall, brown-haired man stood beside a dark-haired woman in an apron, carrying a tray of baked goods from the oven. Between them was a little girl with pigtails, grinning widely, her arms spread as if she wanted to embrace the whole room. On the painted wall, Lily had written in large, slightly uneven letters, "A family smells like a kitchen." Jonathan stood silently for a long moment, his throat tightening. Lily watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. He knelt, pulled her into his arms, holding her gently but with all the emotion he had never been able to put into words. "It's beautiful," he whispered into her hair, his voice roughened. "Did you think of that title yourself?" Lily nodded, cheeks flushed. "Because at our home I don't smell anything. It just feels cold. But at Miss Emily's place, the smell of baked things makes me feel like Mom is near." Jonathan drew her closer, his heart aching in a sweet, tender way, the way a healing wound aches under a soft touch. Lily murmured, "I think if our home had a kitchen smell, Mom would know how to find her way back." Jonathan did not answer. He simply nodded and kissed her forehead. In his mind, Rachel appeared as vividly as ever, her gentle smile, bright eyes, and hands always busy with trays of pastries, the scent of butter, flour, and quiet happiness. In that moment he understood he could no longer hold on to a penthouse that felt cold, its white walls reflecting only memory. He wanted to fill their lives with the present, with new smells, new laughter, the sound of little footsteps circling a warm kitchen, and he knew that none of it would be possible without Emily. That evening he framed Lily's drawing and hung it in the kitchen beside the newly restored family photo. Not to replace, but to continue. Because happiness was not forgetting the one who was gone, but learning how to let them live on through the smallest, warmest things. And for Lily, the smell of baked goods, of cinnamon and butter, was enough to call her mother's name. And for Jonathan, the light in his daughter's eyes every time she stepped into the small kitchen touched by Emily's hands was enough to make him believe they were on the right path, a path that did not require every answer, only the quiet, undeniable signs of a life slowly coming back to life. On a fresh spring morning, gentle sunlight streamed through the windows of Maggie's table, weaving into every small corner and filling the space with a warm, lively glow like a portrait of everyday life. The smell of freshly baked pastries drifted through the room, mixing with the cheerful laughter of a few children gathered around a large table near the kitchen. Emily, wearing a blue striped apron with her hair neatly tied back, leaned over to guide each child as they sprinkled cinnamon onto their tiny apple pies. Beside her was Lily, her face bright and flushed with excitement. She was not only part of the class but also a little assistant, reminding her friends to wash their hands, fetching extra spoons for Emily, and whispering small words of encouragement whenever someone clumsily dropped an egg. From a distance, Jonathan watched in silence. He leaned against the doorframe, a warm cup of coffee in hand, his eyes never leaving the scene before him. It had been a long time since anything had softened him this way, not the quiet of an empty penthouse, but real peace, the kind that rises from laughter, voices calling out to one another, the scent of baking, and the vibrant energy of souls slowly returning to life. Seeing Lily today, he could hardly believe that only a few months earlier she had lain silent in the dark, shutting out the world. And watching Emily, he felt even more certain that the moments we think are coincidences are sometimes the most perfect arrangements of fate. She had not only brought the dish Lily needed, but also offered him a way back to himself, a chance to love again, to build a family grounded in tenderness and healing, not power or control. Jonathan no longer sought answers from the past, nor did he dig through old secrets to explain everything. Some truths did not need to be solved, they only needed to be lived. He stepped forward and sat beside the small baking class, helping a little girl who struggled with a sticky lump of dough. As he gently shaped it into a ball, he looked up at Emily, and their eyes met in a moment that was simple yet profoundly meaningful. No words were needed. Both understood they were writing a new chapter, not to replace what had been lost, but to continue onward with love, patience, and grace. Their story had no dramatic twist, no shocking ending, only the quiet shift from loss to hope, from pain to happiness. And perhaps that was the most beautiful kind of ending life could offer. My dear friends, today's story may have begun with tears and sorrow, but it ends with sunlight, the scent of baking, and the laughter of children. We hope that through the journey of Jonathan, Lily, and Emily, you too have found something to reflect on. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps the courage to move forward after loss, or simply the understanding that sometimes one kind soul passing through our life is enough to change everything. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of a memory, a person, or a moment in your own life? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear from your heart. And if you found meaning in this story, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, so more goodness can be spread each day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this video. We wish you good health, a peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.